Okay, so this whole thing might just be me being completely and utterly paranoid. So if it comes across that way, whatever. But I know something weird is going on. Last night I arrived back home after being in work all day to find that my exterior garage door keypad was left open. It was weird, but I assumed it was more of a malfunction with the equipment than anything else. I sigh, roll my eyes, and make a mental note of calling their customer service line as I go grab the remote to close it over again. Boom. The remote's not working. Every time I hit the close button, the light of the garage door flashes 3 times as usual, but there was no movement. However, the door did close when I used the actual wall-mounted control system. So you can see why I just figured this was a malfunction at first. Electronics malfunction, and that's what they do. Annoying, but it's no big deal. But this new thing just so happened to be the latest in a long list of weird things that have happened in my town over the years. Like I said, maybe I'm just being overly paranoid and I should just follow my ex's advice about getting a dog or something. But either way, I'm starting up my own little investigation, and after about a month or so of mulling it over, I've come to a rather chilling conclusion. That someone has been living in the crawlspace up in my attic. Ironically, I've never been up there. I've been living in this townhouse for coming on 6 months, and I just put it off and put it off. I tried opening the crawlspace in the attic shortly after moving in. I even got a stepladder so I could really try and force the thing open, but it seemed I just couldn't get the leverage to push it open. That, or maybe it has been sealed with paint or something. I planned on using it for some extra storage space, but since that proved to be impossible, I just made do elsewhere. Obviously, my main theory as to why the garage door was open was that there had been some kind of break-in, but it was only when I was trying to work out what had been stolen that I saw the 3 distinct scuff marks on the ceiling where the opening to the crawlspace is. I was almost certain they hadn't been there before, like the whole place had been refurbished and redecorated by the time I moved in. I tried the hatch again, but it's impossible to get into. Only this time, it felt more like it was weighted down by something above it, as opposed to just being sealed shut. This is really rustling my jimmies, but aside from bashing the thing open and causing a butt-ton of structural damage, there really wasn't all that much I could do about it. So, I just head to bed, telling myself I'll lock up all the internal doors I can before I head off to work. Then, that same evening, I come home to find the door handle of the door between the garage and the kitchen had been messed with, like it was actually loose where it hadn't been before. By this point, I'm convinced that someone is regularly breaking into my house whenever I go off to work. It's not like I don't give them ample opportunity either. During the week, I pour 14 hours into every work day, and I tend to work around 8 hours over any set weekend, too. That's just what it takes to run a successful small business these days. I'm not complaining either. I love my job, but to whoever's doing it, my house is mostly empty, so it must seem like fair game to them. During the weeks that followed this little revelation, twice I heard weird noises coming from the attic at night, and on both occasions, I grabbed the biggest, sharpest knife I could find in my kitchen and went to investigate. On both occasions, all was silent when I ventured up there. Silent, yes, and this is going to sound crazy, but I know that there was someone else there with me. I could just feel it. It's honestly quite surreal. I was in this mess in the first place because I'd basically been too frugal to pay someone for a full home inspection. That, and the whole purchase has been really quick because it had been off the back of a tax credit. So about the previous resident, this might be nothing, but the weird financial situation they seemed to be in had my spidey senses tingling. The property itself was a short sale, and the previous occupier was actually renting it for the shockingly low price of $100 a month. How they managed to haggle the owner down, I don't know. But when I went on tour of the house before I moved in, I saw a sleeping bag and only a bag of clothes in the bedroom after being told the tenant hadn't moved any of their stuff out yet. I'm thinking there's a distinct possibility that they were forcibly removed from the house so it could be sold, in which case, maybe they felt a sense of ownership over it. Maybe they couldn't, or wouldn't find a new place. Maybe before they moved out, they made themselves a handy, secretive place to sleep. And I've been sharing a house with a total stranger for more than half a year without ever knowing they were there. Just typing this out has me convinced. I haven't even posted to read any comments or DMs yet, and I've already made up my mind. I know it might sound crazy if I call the cops or whatever, but at this point, I really don't care. I also check out small wireless cameras that I can hook up to my smartphone and bought them pretty much instantly. I'm going to try to get footage of whatever's going on, then use that to back up my reports to the cops. I'll post updates when and if I can. Update. While I called the cops and filed a report, I'll have to finish work early today so I can go talk to them at the house and show them around, but it's all good. I'd rather just get this weight off my mind and I can catch up with work another day. Update 2. I felt like some kind of paranoid maniac telling the cops my conspiracy theory, but they were surprisingly nice about the whole thing. They listened to what I had to say, took everything seriously, and they were great. They did seem to dismiss my whole crawlspace theory as neither of them were able to get the hatch open, but they did say I should replace all the locks and that installing the cameras were most definitely a good idea. They also recommended changing the garage code, and if I actually continuously felt unsafe, that I should invest in a handgun for home defense. I don't think I will get a gun. I'm just not a gun guy, but I will pick up a baseball bat that I'm going to hide under my bed. Update number 3. I've set up my defenses. Well, not so just defenses as detection systems. I got some tape on the crawlspace entry point. I put some boxes up against the attic door. I changed the garage door code. I set up the cameras, all of it. I got the baseball bat under my bed too, so if there's any sneaking around tonight, I'll know about it. Update number 4. I heard the boxes tumble, and I just ran. I can't bring myself to actually face whatever psycho had been content living in that crawlspace for like 7 months now. I'm ashamed, but I just ran to my car with my baseball bat and my PJs, and now I'm at my work office. It's just gone on about 2:30 a.m. and I plan on going back to my house with my coworker first thing in the morning. I asked him if he'd bring a gun. He said yes. I'm going to try and get some sleep for the time being though, but fatigue is hitting me hard. Update number 5. I'm sorry this one's so late, but it's obviously been a busy morning. My coworker has arrived with his weapon, and he also had the foresight to bring along his kid's old selfie stick. We've agreed to just bash the little hatch open, shove the phone up there with its flash on, and find out once and for all if there's been someone living in the crawlspace. Wish us luck. We're going in. Update number 7. It's done. We bashed open the hatch, took a recording of what is up inside, then watched the video back. Although there was no one up there were all sorts of signs of human habitation. There was a dirty mattress, piles of dirty clothes, and all kinds of food wrappers too. So I think it's conclusive. It was never my imagination. It was never just a break-in. Someone was actually living in my house without me knowing, and that's as terrifying as it is depressing. Thanks to everyone who's been supportive. I don't think I've been nearly this brave without all of your kind words and advice. And if there's one thing I can add, it's please don't make the same mistakes as me. Obviously this guy wasn't violent or anything, at least not proactively so, but this whole thing could have been so much worse if this guy happened to want to get me out of the way or whatever. I'm hoping because we crashed his little party up there, that maybe the squatter won't return. But I'm in contact with the police and we're filing a report as we speak. It's baffling them as much as it is me, but there's not much they can do if they don't have a perpetrator. All I can say is that I promise that in the future, I'll be a man of action and not one of inaction. When I was 8 years old, I found a monster in the crawlspace beneath our house. It was without a doubt the most terrifying experience of my entire life, and something I pin the blame of my generalized anxiety disorder on. There's an almost direct thread that runs between the one incident and all of my major phobias, and my therapist even said that my struggle with being intimate with men all stems from associating the dark with horrifying discoveries. I guess by this point you're just anxious to hear about this monster, so I'll get on with the story. According to my mom, I used to be quite a brave kid. Kind of a weird little loner kid, but a very explorative one. I don't know if that's just relatively speaking, and I certainly don't remember being brave. I just know it accounts for me being dumb enough to want to explore the Crawlspace like it'd lead us to some fantastical new world, like Narnia, but for rednecks. I remember filling my backpack up with a bunch of random stuff from the fridge. Like, not even stuff I could actually eat, just stuff I assumed to be able to cook just like my mom did. Toss some stuff in some hot water, wait a while, then boom, pizza. At least, that's just how I thought it worked. The one thing I did get right was a flashlight and like a ton of batteries. So if there was one thing I wouldn't run out of, it was light. But being naive and in my haste to remove all the batteries from all the TV and sound system remotes, I forget to do something pretty crucial, as you'll see in a minute. So I head out into our backyard, over to the spot where there was a slight gap in the boarding under our house. I'd already discovered that it was almost perfectly kid-sized, and I'd come back with all my supplies now that I was ready to explore, whatever it was I thought was under there. I clamber back into the crawl space, switch on my flashlight, then get crawling over to the center. It was slow going because I had to obviously hold my flashlight with one hand and support myself with my other. But slowly and steadily I make my way further and further underneath the house. Then suddenly, of all the things to happen, my flashlight starts flickering. I have like a total panic moment when I'm shaking it around and tapping at it, trying to keep the bulb from dying. I had a buttload of batteries with me, and I'd forgotten to actually put fresh batteries in my little flashlight before I ventured into the crawl space. Talk about top 10 anime betrayals. Only the one that had betrayed me was me. Super meta. So I'm freaking out, crawling around trying to figure out which direction I came in. But because it's all that lattice style of boarding, I'm looking for light to recognize where I came in, only there's little specks of it all around me, and it was a nightmare. But after about a minute or so, I keep telling myself I have all my batteries tucked away, and if I can just get one out of my back, I'll be able to change the batteries over using what small amount of light I have already. I'd already practiced changing the batteries on my flashlight a bunch. I was obsessed with the thing since I used to use it to read my storybooks after Mom and Dad had called lights out. So as much as it might have been a challenge for any other kid to do something kind of complicated in low light conditions, I was like a freaking Navy SEAL with that stuff, and managed to get them all switched over, even though I thought I was practically vibrating from the sudden fright. I screw the top back on, flick the flashlight on, then shine it around myself to see if I had left any loose batteries. And that's when I see it. It was the single most horrifying thing I'd ever seen, before or since. It had those huge, jet black eyes, presumably because it didn't get any light down there, along with a row of bony, dagger-like teeth that seemed to only loosely set in its jaw. As for a nose, it just didn't seem to have one. There were these huge, cavernous gaps that I'm assuming acted as its nostrils. I didn't stick around to analyze it any longer. I let out what my dad later described as the most ear-splitting screech he'd ever heard from man or beast, and then scrambled out from that crawl space faster than a jackrabbit. I'd left everything behind under there too. Backpack, flashlight, every single AA battery I think in the entire house. So when I told my dad I'd almost been eaten by a monster, and that there was like 20 AAs under the house, he had more than enough incentive to go deal with it. He pulls back a bunch of boarding, crawls under there himself, but I don't hear the monster attacking him or anything, so I just ask like, "Daddy, is the monster still there?" He responds, "No, sweetie, no monster. And I got your backpack. Now, let's get cleaned up, okay? It's nasty in here." I didn't find out until quite a while later that the monster I saw under there was actually a dog skeleton. And not just any dog skeleton either. It was our family's dog that had gone missing less than a year before. I'd been absolutely heartbroken that she'd gone missing. Me and Dad had plastered the neighborhood with missing posters, but obviously we didn't hear anything back, and by then, we knew why. My therapist thinks that, even though I was so young, that it still somehow registered that this was Lulu, the dog's name, by the way. But instead of just confronting the fact that it was her, I told myself it was a monster. But I did this for literally years, convinced of the existence of otherworldly beings right up until I started youth counseling, where I was advised to actually talk to my dad about it. We talked, there were tears, but it was definitely something I needed. And if you haven't guessed right now, it was never really about seeing a monster. It was about confronting mortality, my own at that. Finding Lulu was definitely the scariest thing that happened to me when I was a kid. But play stupid games and win stupid prizes, I suppose. I grew up here in Quebec, Canada, and I'm proud to say that I'm every bit the French-Canadian stereotype. I love hockey, beer, poutine, and maple sugar pie, and there's an embarrassing number of plaid shirts in my closet. Back when I was a teenager, I didn't care what happened about politics or history, not unless it was entirely Québécois. I know that might sound ignorant or insular, but I wasn't malicious about it. I just felt my eyes glazing over when anyone talked about stuff that didn't affect me personally. Look, the point is, there is a time in my life when I was just happy, naive, and dumb as a rock, and the only thing I ever had weighing on my mind was my GPA. I was happy. But all that changed when mon grand-père passed away. My grandpa was like my favorite person ever, and I was absolutely devastated when he died. He was the only grandparent I ever had the chance to get close to, and with me being his only grandson, I guess that special feeling was mutual. Every visit to his house was an adventure. Every time he visited ours, he brought me a gift. But Grandpa also was pretty strict. He always had me say please and thank you. I always had to be in bed and no lights for a certain time if I wanted to do fun stuff. I had to do chores, stuff like that. He wasn't a tyrant by any stretch. I guess he wanted to impart a little discipline into me. It was pretty normal when you think about it, but he was tough. You see, Grandpa used to be in the military. In fact, he'd fought during the Second World War and gotten medals for bravery. After the war, he moved to Quebec, married my grandma, and the two raised a wonderful family together. He didn't talk about it much. I asked him about it a few times, but he always gave me the same old answer. It was a terrible time. Life in Canada is much better. He didn't have any pictures, no keepsakes from his time in the army, at least not to my knowledge. It was the only piece of history or whatever that I cared about, and it was out of bounds. So, the rest I could care less about. But anyway, about a week after the funeral, me and my mom went over to his place to start clearing it out. About 3 days in, we'd worked our way all through almost every room in the house. It had been an emotional affair, to say the least, trying to decide which were the precious heirlooms and which to donate to a little charity store my mom had her eye on. And keep in mind that basically everything was a precious heirloom, and you have no idea how tough it was. Mom was clearing out some of the stuff in my grandpa's bedroom, while I had the unenviable task of clearing out the dustiest room in the whole place, the attic. I don't think anyone at all had been up there going on 10 years. Everything was covered up in a layer of dust so thick it was actually kind of impressive. I actually had to cover my face with a t-shirt to stop from inhaling so much gunk as I began to move stuff around. It took almost a full hour to sort the boxes of newspapers from the stuff worth keeping, then another hour of sweeping and dusting before the small attic room looked somewhat fit for human habitation. On top of that, there was so much dirt on the ceiling that it obscured a little opening in the painted ceiling. So, being the curious, innocent soul that I was, I gave it a push to see if it would open up. Lo and behold, it did. But at first I had zero intentions of sticking my head into a dark, dusty crawl space. Best case scenario, I inhale a bunch of dust. Worst case scenario, I get my head bitten off by some sort of monster living up there. But like I said, I was an innocent, curious soul. Because of how low the ceiling was, I could basically look up into the crawl space if I stood up on my tippy toes. First time I poke my head up, there's just darkness and dust. But when I try with my flashlight, hoping it's all clear of wasp nests or whatever so I don't have to spend like another hour battling filth, I see that something's up there. It's a burlap sack, fairly small, just sitting there in the middle of the crawl space. It might as well have been screaming out, "What's in me, dude? Don't you want to know what's in me?" Because yeah, I really did want to know. We already found some old South African gold coins, like a bunch of them too. And if Grandpa just had those sitting in an old office drawer, God knows what he actually is choosing to hide. I jump up there, flashlight between my teeth, and give the sack a nudge to see if there's anything inside. Indeed, there was. Something heavy and metallic, so immediately I'm thinking, more gold coins. Let me tell you, my heart was racing as I climbed back down into the attic where there was a little bit more light. I emptied the sack out, and out falls an old tin box that turned out to be a tobacco tin, a piece of dirty-looking red cloth, and a small leather-bound book. Obviously, I go for the tobacco tin first, thinking it might have more of those gold coins in it. Opening it up, I don't see any coins, but I see ribbons, like military ribbons, and I realize I might have come across something a little bit more valuable than just a couple $100 in precious metals. I realize that leather-bound book that fell out might just be my grandpa's war diaries, or at least an account of his move from post-war Europe to Canada. Either way, I was hooked, so I opened the diary near the opening pages to start checking for dates. Like I said, I was pretty uninterested in history, but I at least knew that most of World War II took place in the early 40s, so when I see dates like 2nd Juillet 1942, I know I'm on the money for it being some kind of war diary. Here's, once again, where I need to emphasize my ignorance of world history, and I imagine what I read would have been confusing for someone with actual knowledge of it. But even then, if I'd have read up on a little bit more of World War II, if I'd been like my buddy who was like an expert on that stuff, all from video games of all things, I'd have known something was up a little bit earlier. Most of the diary entries were pretty mundane stuff. He was on a guard duty, the food sucked, he was looking forward to leaving. Every so often he'd mention how a prisoner tried to escape, which I obviously assumed was a German prisoner, and they had to shoot him. That was generally about as harsh as it got, and it was clear his duties kept him away from the front lines. I did catch a couple of mentions of Sovietique et Russe, but they were our allies, right? No big deal. Keep in mind that I'm not reading the diary cover to cover, I'm jumping around, skipping back and forth, too excited to really sit there and study it. So it was only when I read an entry from 1944 that I started to get real confused as to what exactly I was reading. It said, "I killed a Russian today." I wandered away from our position to relieve myself. He had the same idea. Once I finished him off, I unbuckled his belt to find out if he was Jewish or not. He was, so I cut off his head, and the other thing to take back to show the men. I thought my French was failing me, or that Grandpa was using some kind of old slang. He definitely used an old French slur for Jewish folks, which is why I was so confused at first. But once I did a little research, the terrible truth became clear. My grandpa had fought during World War II, all right, but he hadn't fought for the French army, or any other Allied army for that matter, and I can't even express the gut-wrenching feeling of horror I felt when I unfurled the piece of red cloth and saw what it was. It was a swastika, a Nazi flag. Right then, I hear my mom calling for me, and my first thought was, I can't let her see this. She was no historian herself, but I at least knew she had the abstract pride about him having done his part. I mean, I did too, I suppose. So for her to find out her pop was a Nazi, when she was such a bleeding heart liberal herself, I think it would have killed her. So before I go down to meet her, I throw the stuff back into the bag, toss it back into the crawl space, and tell myself I'll go back for it under the guise of wanting to spend a little time at the old house before it got sold. It was the weirdest feeling, dreading reading what else was in that diary, but also barely being able to eat or sleep until I'd finally burned through every word. I mean, how else does a normal person react when they find out that their grandparent fought for the Nazis? It was maybe 4:30 in the morning when I finally gave up on getting any sleep. I got up, put on some clothes, and rode my bike over to my grandfather's place. I left a note for my mom on the table explaining where she could find me, then set off to face the music. It was the longest ride of my life. Somehow 10 minutes stretched out to feel more like an hour, and by the time I actually pulled up outside the house, I was honestly debating just burning the contents of that burlap sack and never thinking about it again. But that was a dumb idea, a coward's idea, a surefire way to ensure that I slowly went insane from wondering what happened to my grandpa to turn into such a, and I don't even have trouble typing this out today, such a monster. I retrieved the diary and tobacco tin from the burlap sack, dusting myself off before I took a seat at the kitchen table and began reading. If I typed out every passage where something of note happened, I'd be writing this out for weeks, maybe even a year. It might even make for an interesting book if it hadn't been such an infinite source of shame for me. I imagine people might want to learn a thing or two from my grandpa's experiences. I certainly had no idea that any other nationalities fought for the Nazis other than the Germans, not ones that you'd traditionally think of being against them. So, to save us all the time, I'll just type out a little extract to give you an idea of how utterly horrifying it was, and this isn't even the worst bit. Every day the Russians get closer and closer to Berlin, and every day the German people show how weak they are. Every one of them that I see fleeing the city makes me want to pump someone's air. This just means angry. When the Charlemagne division was ordered to set up checkpoints to catch deserters, I decided to take the initiative. Any woman or man who was old or fit enough to fire a rifle, we took them off to the side to sign some papers before sending the rest of their group on their way. We enjoyed killing the cowards with our bare hands, and the women we kept around to keep us company. Shooting people is very impersonal. Using your hands gives a much greater feeling of power. And what else does a man need after a kill but a woman? It was all so much fun being behind the lines for the first time in months. One girl decided to spoil all our fun by cutting both her and her little sister's throat. Then, not only had we lost 2 girls, but the others were suddenly of bad hair, which means upset. So that was the end of that. After reading, the idea came back to me to burn it all. It was something I never wanted another living soul to know about my family. But then again, I kind of figured I'd be doing the world a disservice, and maybe myself. Maybe I considered this some type of confession. I also figured people might be able to figure out where someone's long-lost loved one was on the back of what the diary included. If I did that, maybe I'd be balancing the books somehow, even if it was just a little. But if I do end up sending it into a museum or something, it won't be until after my mom passes. I imagine it'll be quite the big news for her, especially in today's political climate, and the last thing I want is her getting any of the backlash. So for now, I guess I'll just keep my grandpa's secret, and just keep on trying to slowly accept that it has no real bearing on my life or my mother's. But I still think I'll do some type of volunteer work this summer. Maybe balance the books a little more, in my mind. Some sort of penance. All for the people in Berlin that day who tried to get away. I've worked as a carpenter and joiner here in Australia since I was 16 years old, and part of my job involves doing full house inspections. These are by far one of the most annoying parts of the job, as they can be awkward, drawn-out affairs where homeowners bark at me to do my job whilst also making it as difficult as possible. But I'd take 100 moody homeowners over one crawl space. They're my nemesis. I absolutely hate them. They're dark, dank, dusty, and can be really bloody dangerous. Generally speaking, the worst you're going to get are a few spider webs and a lung full of dust, maybe some kind of horrible-looking creepy crawly if you're really unlucky. But if your luck is particularly abominable, as mine happened to be one day, you'll come face to face with something considerably worse. Obviously, I only go into a crawl space with some kind of flashlight, but something the absent-mindedness with which they're constructed means they're full of little nooks and crannies that A, you can't see around, and B, cause some pretty creepy shadows that might conceal a huntsman's spider until it's too late. I've lost count of the number of times I've rounded some dark alcove only to find some massive, hairy spider staring right back at me. Better than a kick in the teeth, sure, but still not pleasant in the least bit. So on this one occasion, I'm in this really old house with not one, but two big crawl spaces. One between two internal walls on the ground floor and one beneath the ground floor itself. I get the ground floor done nice and quickly, but I'm dreading the first floor. I'm not saying I had a sixth sense moment or I had a bad feeling about it or anything. I just couldn't be bothered. Crawl spaces are bad enough on their own. 2 in one day is just rubbing salt in the wound. So finally, right before I'm due to finish for the day, I head into the room with the carpets removed to start pulling up some floorboards. I'd expected some cobweb infestation, but at first, the underfloor crawl space didn't seem that bad at all. There were hardly any spider webs, and there actually seemed to be a bit of daylight getting in from somewhere, which would make my job considerably easier. The only trouble with there being no spider webs in there is there's nothing to catch some of the smaller and usually deadlier creepy crawlies down there. But a preliminary flashlight inspection showed it was pretty much empty. Lucky me, I remember thinking, happy that I'd gotten off lightly with a relatively clean crawl space. But the lack of insect life and the sliver of daylight I was seeing, those should have really keyed me into something that I was honestly too dozy to anticipate. Because when I crawled down into the opening and shuffled along the ground to inspect the timber down there, I heard something that made the hackles go up on my neck. I shined my flashlight around in a panic, trying to find the source of the noise, and in one particularly shady corner, I saw this huge brown snake, all curled up and ready to strike. I'd always wondered if I was ever going to find a snake on the job like that, and that was one way to get an answer. It's no further than 10 feet away from me, obviously having snuck into the crawl space using whatever hole was letting the daylight in. Just so you know, untreated brown snake bites can kill you in about 30 minutes. And guess what? They're one of the most commonly encountered snakes here in Australia. I don't think there's a single snake on Earth that's killed so many people over the years, and it's purely because of how bloody aggressive they are. I'd only had one other scary encounter with a snake back when I was a kid, and guess what? It was a bloody brown snake, wasn't it? But anyway, so back to my life and death moment in this crawl space. I should also really add that this whole thing happened in February, a time of year when people all over Australia are warned to be extra vigilant in their gardens because of it being mating season for snakes. They get doubly bloody aggressive during that time, and my complete foolishness in throwing myself down in that crawl space without a proper prior inspection, well, that was probably now going to cost me my life. But like I mentioned, I used my little torch to find the angry little bugger, this little pen torch thing that I could clip to my shirt. I very, very slowly placed the torch down so I can use both hands to start backing away from the snake, and it just so happened that my little pen torch saved my life. It was a really powerful little thing, and I'm guessing the snake was picking up the heat and light of its little bulb and thinking that was the thing that disturbed its horny slumber. Right as I'm about to escape, the brown snake lunges for the pen torch and tries plunging its fangs into it. To think that if I'd frozen up, or if I'd moved a bit too hastily on my way out, that could have easily have been me. But it's not even necessarily the bite that's so terrible when it comes to Aussie snakes. It's the treatment. A mate of mine's uncle was bitten by a taipan years back, and he said all the jabs and the pills were worse than the bloody bite itself. That's mainly what I was afraid of, not so much not getting to a hospital in time, but the months of therapy afterwards where I could lose out on work or have some kind of permanent nerve damage. Needless to say, I decided to invest in some little fiber optic cameras. They're the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a Mission Impossible movie or something, and they've ended the need to be climbing into small spaces altogether. Needless to say, I love them. They save me time and effort, and there's a good chance they might save my bloody life at some point, too. During the summer of 2017, my wife and I moved into our first real family home, along with our 5-year-old daughter Emily. It was an absolute dream come true. Getting onto the property ladder here in the UK isn't exactly easy, especially if you're living in a major city. So the fact that we actually managed to land a place we liked, it was like all our Christmases had come at once. And just when I thought our luck couldn't get any better, the first few years living there was completely hassle-free. The pipes survived the winter, the plumbing was reliable, and all the appliances that came with the house were built like tanks. We were living the dream. There was just one thing that really bothered me and my wife about our new home, and that came in the form of the pictures my daughter started to draw one day. It was a weeknight, and I had not been home from work too long when my wife called me down for tea. Emily is 5.5 at this point, and ever since her Nana bought her a load of paper and colored pens, she'd revealed something of an artistic side. At first, me and the wife were just happy she was sticking to paper and not getting back into her old graffitiing habits. But when she started to show some actual talent, we started to wonder if we had a budding Tracy Emin on our hands. Like most kids, she just drew what she saw around her. She drew me and her mom, that cat from next door, flowers from the garden, that sort of thing. That progressed to what amounted to diagrams of whatever room she'd be in at the time. Then she'd draw rudimentary diagrams of the whole house. Whenever she rocked up with a new picture, we did what any proud parent would do and whacked it straight on the fridge. All except one picture, which caused a bit of a stir. Emily had drawn a picture of herself sitting in her room. The way she'd draw a room was to first draw a box, then fill it up with whatever objects there were, labeling them things like bed, teddy, me. But in this case, she'd draw another much smaller box that sat on the very top right-hand corner of her ceiling, one that contained a small horizontal stick figure, with 2 dots for eyes and a straight line for a mouth. And unlike pretty much everything else, he wasn't labeled. "Wow," I remember saying. "Rach, come look at what Em drew." I was a bit unnerved by the little addition, but I didn't make it obvious. I just sort of motioned to my wife when she turned to look at it. "Emily," my wife spoke in that sing-song way that grown-ups talk to kids, while she pointed to the boxed-up stick figure. "Who's this person here?" Emily just shrugged. "Why did you draw him, Emily?" "Because he's there." This bristling tension comes over me and the wife, and we shoot each other a look while Emily just cracks on drawing another picture. She's not acting moody or anything, and she's just happily cracking on with drawing another picture, but needless to say, me and Rachel weren't in the least bit happy. "Emily," my wife continued, "does this person do anything?" "No," she replied. "He's only a little boy." "Does he watch you from the window or something?" I asked. It was a probing question, but I honestly was just trying to make sense of it. "He doesn't watch me. He's just there." She shrugged again, obviously unable to explain it any further than that. "But Emily," my wife leaned in to talk to her, "where is the little boy?" "In the ceiling." Again, this wave of tension washes over me and my wife, but we really didn't act on anything she was saying. Kids say all sorts of things. Sometimes things that are horribly offensive, accidentally hilarious, or in this case, alarmingly creepy. We asked Emily a few more questions about the boy, but she just kept shrugging them off and telling us she didn't know. In the end, me and the wife just put it down to her imagination. Maybe she was lonely. Maybe it was time for us to start thinking about getting a cat or something. Heck, maybe it was time to start thinking about giving her a little brother or sister to dote over. Either way, the weird picture was just sort of forgotten about after a while. Emily got to drawing other things, started asking us about painting, and we all just moved on. About 18 months go by, and by that time, Emily is 7. We'd continued to nurture her artistic side, buying her a paint set, a kid's encyclopedia of artists and all their styles, and she was just mad about it. She was particularly enthralled with this one Monet painting, saying she loved how pretty the colors were, and after that, all she painted were these colorful outdoor scenes. Her little pot of black paint went almost untouched, until one Sunday afternoon, when it was the only color she used. She blacked out this huge section of an A3 piece of paper, leaving only a small rough square untouched in the center. And in this little blank spot, she painted what looked a lot like a little boy with a very sad expression on his face. I had a good feeling I knew what, or rather, who it was, but I still asked, "And who's this sad little boy, Emily?" "I don't know." "Emily, is this the boy who lives in the ceiling?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "Why is he so sad?" "Because he wants to get out." "Why don't you let him out then? Why don't you draw a picture of him playing with Kit, our new cat, outside?" I suggested. "He can't come out. He's stuck in there. I want to help him, but..." Emily's voice began to break up as her eyes filled with tears. I tried my best to be the supportive dad that I was. I gave her a big hug and told her it was all okay, that I was proud of her for caring. But in reality, I was actually absolutely terrified. This was absolutely so much more than just a childhood phase, and whether it was loneliness, anxiety, or something else to blame, my daughter was suffering, and that just broke my heart as a father. We arranged for her to see a counselor that a friend of ours had recommended. Their kid had taken it hard when their friend from school passed away. It's another horrible story on its own. And they said weekly visits to this particular professional had quickly caused an upward curve in his mood. I know people might complain that we should have just parented our own bloody kid, but we were young parents. We didn't have a freaking clue what we were doing, and no one else seemed to know what to do about Emily's sad little imaginary friend. She just wouldn't drop it. After 3 weeks of visits to this woman, she gave me a call one day with the last thing I expected to hear. "Sir, have you actually checked if there's any kind of crawl space above your daughter's bedroom?" 600 pounds in fees, and that was her line of inquiry. I don't know if I was angry at the insinuation or just embarrassed that, well, no, I hadn't checked. But why would I? If your kid says that there's a monster under your bed, you don't toss a grenade under there, do you? Kids say all sorts of things. The counselor knew this, and apparently she had the experience to understand when a kid was just making stuff up, and when there was some substance to what they were saying, which I suppose is exactly what we were paying her to do. I was so confident that there was no crawl spaces that I remember saying, "Just hold the line and I'll go check." It would be a 30-second job. Stick my head in, see no hatches, walk back and tell the woman no. Just me doing my due diligence, trying to help my kid. So I march upstairs, walk into Emmy's room, she's out with her mom at the time, and take a short, pointless glance at the ceiling. Nothing. But just as I'm about to walk out, a thought hits me. Check the cupboard. Emmy had this big, tall cupboard built into the western-facing wall, and she used to keep her toys in it. And that day, for the first time since we moved in, I noticed it had a much higher ceiling than the rest of the room. Lo and behold, I poked my head in, looked up, and there it was. a hatch leading to a crawl space above my daughter's bedroom. My mind is blown. I mean, I'm not freaking out or anything, but still, you can imagine how surprised I am that my daughters seemed to know more about the house than I did. But regardless, me and the counselor finished up the call by agreeing that somehow Emmy had been playing in the cupboard and had just so happened to catch sight of the hatch. Sound logic told her that something was obviously on the other side, yet it was her imagination that brought out all the trapped boy stories. I hang up the phone, thank the counselor. I'm talking genuinely thanking her, though. It was a stroke of genius gambling on there actually being a crawl space. And then I'm alone in our big, quiet house. It's then that it occurs to me that not only did I not even know about that crawl space, I still don't actually know what's in it. I stopped giving a toss about horror films when I was about 16. Last thing I actually remember watching from start to finish was the remake of The Ring. So it's not like I myself had an overactive imagination. I wasn't obsessed with ghosts or anything, and I certainly didn't believe in anything remotely paranormal. But in that case, why was I fixated on the idea of finding human remains in that crawl space? Why was I so bloody terrified to actually open up the hatch and shine a light inside? All of Emily's fears and sadness, her apparent conviction that someone was up there, I'm ashamed to say that it had somehow rubbed off on me. So much so that I was actually incredibly nervous by the time I was clearing out some toys, stepping into the cupboard, and peering up at the hatch. I reach up, unlock the little hatch's lock, and then opened it up. It was the perfect jump scare moment. Absolutely textbook, switch my light on and there's a little horror child's rotten evil face kind of shot. But as you can imagine, there was none of that. No ghosts, no bodies, no malevolent spirits whatsoever. But I did see something sitting on the wooden boards gathering dust. I thought it was a tiny bowling pin at first, but it wasn't. It was one of those little Russian dolls. And the image painted on it wasn't that of some colorfully clothed babushka. It was of a little boy with a distinctly blank expression. It was covered in dust. No one had put it here recently, and no one had opened up that hatch since we've gotten here, especially not 4-foot-tall Emily. I showed her the little Russian doll when she got home, but I didn't tell her where it was from. She didn't really react to it. Gave it a curious once-over before putting it down, but I didn't see anything resembling a flash of recognition in her eyes. And funnily enough, after finding the doll, she didn't mention there being anyone in the ceiling anymore, which we were obviously all too glad of. I know the simplest explanation is the most likely one, that it was nothing more than a vaguely creepy coincidence. It just sticks with me because I don't know how to explain it. Why Emmy stopped talking about the boy in the ceiling. I mean, she was fixated on it, on and off, for quite a while. Then I show her a dusty, moody-looking Russian doll, and it all just stops. And no point in my suggesting that it was a ghost, a spirit, anything like that. But is it possible that Emily was just of a certain age where she could feel things that others couldn't? That she somehow, I don't know, picked it up like a bat uses radar or something, not knowing what it was, just knowing it's there. That might sound absolutely mental to some people, and I'll take it on the chin if you want to call me a nutbag or tell me how wrong or stupid I am. I'll take it. Anything to be a step closer to understanding exactly how my daughter knew that there was something above her room, something she couldn't see, but that was definitely 100%, unequivocally, there. I worked in pest control for over 20 years of my life, and let me tell you, Crawlspaces put my kids through college. Why in God's name any architect in their right mind would design or implement what's basically a built-in home for vermin and other little beasties, God only knows. But needless to say, those things have been a major source of revenue for me over the years. But one crawlspace in particular almost took everything from me. And after that, I viewed them much more like potential tombs than dusty old cash cows. So about 10 years ago now, we were treating this one big old house for termites. The entire thing had a crawl space built right on top of its foundations, and the thing was evidently just a breeding ground for a variety of invasive pests. I mean, it was huge, dark, damp, and there was ample access to all kinds of wooden beams and floorboards that became a straight-up feast for the termites. The only entrance was this tiny trap door that was built into the floor of a closet, but the area I actually needed to inspect was way on the other side of the house. So basically, I'd have to crawl maybe 50 or 60 meters across a dark, filthy, potentially termite-infested nastiness to check if one particularly infested area had been fully gassed out. If it was, no problem. If it wasn't, I'd be shaking the termites out of my hair until lunch. Not necessarily scary, but it turns out it wasn't so much the termites I should have been worried about. So right away, first thing I noticed about this particular crawl space is how humid it was. It turned out the family had someone stuff insulation all around the edges, and I'm almost certain these were designed to help keep the home's occupants cooler in the summer. I suppose it'd work in theory, but the family must have just wanted to save on heating bills. As a result, it was like a freaking sauna down there. Not only that, while I was down there, I discovered a leak on one of the big old cast iron pipes, like there was an actual damp spot just helping saturate the area with moisture. Granted, it turned out that I didn't actually have to crawl through any of that mess, as someone had the foresight to install a mechanic's creeper right beneath the trap door, but still, it was a real mess down there. Anyway, I lay down in the creeper, tucked my tool bag underneath me, then pushed myself over to the problem area. I figured it must have been somewhere underneath the kitchen because there are a lot of the same ancient-looking pipes running here and there, but that's where I saw a whole bunch of termite damage to some of the sill plates and all the floor joists. No signs of any termites, but the family was looking at one heck of a bill to get it all torn out and replaced. So, I get finished up with my inspection, and I'm ready to start wheeling myself back towards the trap door. I reach up, grab a hold of two sister joints to give myself some push, and I feel them just crumble in my hand. I mean, those things just crumbled like cigar tobacco. It was frankly amazing they still existed given their condition. Then it hits me that pretty much the only thing stopping the ground floor from collapsing altogether is a bunch of other sister joints like the ones that I was in the process of dusting off my fingers. And if they were anything like the ones in question, all that stood between me and getting buried alive were a few pieces of rotten wood. I start calling out to my guys upstairs for everyone to walk out of the house one by one and to tread very, very lightly as they did so. Obviously, it was perfectly evident why I was asking them to do that, and now I'm not just sweating my butt off from the rainforest here humidity, I'm also sweating bullets because I'm convinced that I'm about to die, or at least suffer serious injuries at the very minimum. When the last man was out, I slowly wheeled myself back over to the trap door, not touching anything, not saying a word. Heck, I didn't even look at any more of the crumbling wooden joints just in case they thought that I was giving them the stink eye and decided to collapse on me. Obviously, I got out of there okay, and no one else was permitted from going down there without first tearing up the floorboards and completely restructuring the thing. But my God, I've never been one of those people who are particularly scared of being buried alive, but you can bet your butt I am now. That horrid, crazy panic. You get the idea of being trapped, of not being able to move or breathe, and all you can do is just scream for help as you slowly expire. Ugh, it makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. So please, if you have a crawl space in your home, don't let your kids go playing around in it, and make sure it's blocked off, but not just sealed up with plastic or whatever, so some poor neighborhood kitty cat crawls inside, gets trapped, and ends up stinking up your digs. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, or email, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And be sure to check your crawl spaces.